Okay, thanks everybody for joining us for our ANCO discussion series. We are Yard & Company, an urban design and planning firm based in Cincinnati, Ohio. Over the last 7 or 8 weeks, we've been hosting conversations on different topics related to how cities are responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. Our topics have ranged across the board from public space and streets to district management, including 2 weeks ago. We spoke with Sean Suter from Calfee Zoning about zoning and regulations in the age of COVID. These topics are typically about how we're responding to things like spatial distancing and other elements that are happening right now, and also how they're hopefully shaping some positive outcomes for cities, even when this is hopefully behind us sooner rather than later. Today, our guest is our colleague and friend, Lauren Hood. Lauren and I were on a session last week, a panel discussion for Congress for New Urbanism, which was a lot of fun. So I feel like this is going to be a continuation of that. Lauren is a Detroit resident, born and raised. She serves as a translator and negotiator between development entities and citizen stakeholders. Through her work as an equitable development strategist, she has developed engagement frameworks, facilitated tough dialogues, created platforms that allow for the emergence and inclusion of often unrecognized place-based expertise in city planning and neighborhood development processes. I think ultimately, one way to describe Lauren is that she is good at forcing people in the planning, design, and development profession to have tough conversations that often aren't had. And turn those into productive outcomes in urban neighborhoods and places. So Lauren, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Kevin.
So as I said, this feels to me like a bit of a continuation of our talk last week at CNU, and then dating back even to last year when we hung out in Cincinnati for a couple of days and had conversations leading up to the Louisville Congress for New Urbanism. So let's just get right to it. How do you think this moment can potentially be a moment for us to hit the reset button when it comes to engaging communities, particularly Black and Brown communities? So how do you think, or I guess two parts to that question. Do you think this is a reset moment? And if it is, what should we be resetting and how?
I'm not sure if reset is the word I'm thinking of. I think it is an opportunity to expand the conversation to include people that are just having their light bulb moments over the past week. So for Black folks and Brown folks in the planning profession, like this is a conversation we've always been having. We've been yelling like, listen. And I feel like now people are like, what was that thing you were saying back then? So it's not like we're all having a new conversation. For some people it's new, but for some of us, it's the conversation we've been trying to have since the very beginning. I feel like it is a moment that we can make bold ask. We can use terminology that people have been afraid of, like white supremacy, colonization, reparations. I feel like there is, albeit small, a big opening to just kind of have the conversation we should have been having all along. And because everybody now is thinking about racial equity, I think that, like I said, it's time to make bold ask. No need to hold back now. Like, I think we have a small window of opportunity, like a short period of time, but like big things can happen in this short period of time.
And to get kind of specific around that, let's say there are planning firms like ours and others that are in the process of starting a new master plan for a neighborhood or city. What's the best way to bridge that gap between this conversation that's hopefully not short-term, that's hopefully not a trend, and really, make sure that that is embedded into the process that's about to take place in those kind of communities?
Well, I think we have to reframe what information has value in these planning processes. I think that the way it is operated up until now is that people with, you know, the letters after our name in planning or community development, the knowledge we bring to the table has kind of been at the top of a pyramid. So I think moving forward, there should be no hierarchy of knowledge. We got to kind of flatten that out and recognize that people that have been in a place for several decades have a PhD in that place. So their knowledge should be recognized at the same level and compensated. This is something I've tried to do when I've been in control of budgets before, but make room to pay people for their contributions. Like, that is how we show things have value in this capitalistic framework that we work in. So why aren't we compensating people that we ask to give up like half a day's time to talk about their neighborhood? It's about a consciousness shift as we move forward. It's not about this little thing we can do right now that's really short-lived, but how do we like change the practice for good from this moment on?
Great.
And Lauren, what kind of multiplier effect has COVID had on, as you mentioned, a conversation that's been had and been having, we've all been having it for a long time, but as you mentioned, in certain corners of the world, they've been shouting and nobody's been listening. What multiplier on the process, on people's listening ears, on people's starting point has COVID had for not just communities of color, but communities across the board in listening to those shouting claims that have been hidden?
That is a good question. I will talk about the process that I'm working on right now. So there's a strategic planning process for 3 neighborhoods on the east side of Detroit. The client is really the community, but on paper, it's the city planning department. And something that those of us working in planning in Detroit have always talked about is, why aren't we talking about racial equity? The planning teams are always white. The community is 80% Black. What is going on? Why have we not talked about this? But for the first time, like on this process, we got our, the planner in the planning department that's heading this initiative is putting like in the messaging words like racial equity. We're saying the things that we weren't saying before. So I feel like it's unprecedented to have a planner in city government using words like racial equity in the messaging that goes out to community members to show up for a conversation. So instead of talking about streetscape, we're like, nope, today's conversation is about racial equity. Deal with it, But from those conversations, as planners, we can translate what people say into things that we can apply to the specific focus areas of the plan we're working on. So how the city's plan is like, we're going to focus on streetscape, commercial corridor development, but we're able to extract from a conversation on racial equity the things that people think are important and can apply them to those focus areas. I think that is more our job than the way we've previously framed it.
Well, just to stick on that for a second, maybe illustrate with a few examples or anecdotes from those processes of how the planning team, whether it's capital P or lowercase p, has been able to say, we have, for instance, these equity concerns or issues that we've been wrestling with, but you want to talk about streetscape. How are those connections being formed? What is it about this moment that we're able to influence the way we think about streets or retail along streets that reinforces the equity conversation?
Well, what is the dynamic that has shifted on our team is the people that used to do all the talking were the people with the expertise in like engineering, like landscape architects. But the way we've shifted it is the engagement consultant, which is the team that I'm on now, leads the discussion, which is how it always should have been. We advocated for that in the beginning, but it really wasn't happening. But now they're like, we don't know how to have this conversation. Can you guys do it? Like, yeah, we told you. So there's probably somebody on these teams that people have been working with the expertise that hasn't been getting heard. So when you look at like the people in the streets, because their voices aren't being heard, but if you can think about teams you've worked on where there's probably a team member that hasn't been getting their voice heard, because I have felt that way on teams in the past. So it's not like it's a thing that's out there. It's like, it's right here.
Do you find that the whole discussion around what is public space, who is it for, what is it for, that COVID has kind of also brought to the light? Does that provide a window into reframing that conversation in a different way, or how?
It does, and I think if we can combine some thinking on our responses to COVID and the responses to worldwide protests and apply it to a public space lens, like how can public spaces be restorative? How can they be healing spaces? How can they promote connecting across differences? I think we stick with like, what does the layout look like? We got to be thinking about like, what do we want to happen in this place? And then the layout follows that.
Yeah. Are you seeing much in the way of leveraging, some people call it COVID streets. We had Mike Leiden on earlier, others, just the broader open streets movement, however so defined. Do you find that to be a useful tool to actually taking over the street in new ways and focusing on the what do we want to happen here, given that we have this opportunity? Or is that in the communities where you're working, are those kind of separate issues? And
well, it's really interesting because we've opened up here in the past couple of weeks. Like we can go back out in public spaces with limited capacities. But Black folks still aren't out as much. I think we are reacting very differently to COVID. So in the news, like Black folks have seen that disproportionately we contract and die from COVID. So disproportionately more than white folks. And we are not back out there yet. Like I live in Midtown and I take like a 1.5 hour walk to the riverfront every day, and I see patios full of white folks, not social distancing and with no mask on. We're still scared because we lost friends and family members. I just lost one very good friend, but I am 1 degree of separation from probably dozens of COVID deaths. So my peers' response to getting back out there is a lot more, we're a lot more cautious. We're not necessarily ready to be out in those streets yet.
Does the whole essential versus non-essential dynamic that's taken over play into that as well, where essential workers are, disproportionately represented?
Fortunately Black. Yep. Yeah. Amazon Prime guy delivering packages at my building every day is always Black. The DoorDasher that's bringing my pizza is always Black. So aside from those of us that have to be out there right now, I just think we're not making the choice to be out there if we don't have to.
Yeah.
Well, and circling back to the streets conversation, the democratization of streets is a critical tool for urban planners, urban designers, when it comes to land use and all that technical stuff. If you have a street that is 5 or 6 lanes wide and is devoted 100% to cars, whether you're in a white community, Black community, brown community, that's generally not a good thing. But oftentimes we come in, and I'm gonna give my own opinion here and just see how you react to it. Oftentimes we come into neighborhoods with terminology and jargon around open streets, bike lanes, cycle tracks, and start using that language, and then it automatically doesn't feel as if it's for the community that we're talking about, or talking with. And I had a conversation with somebody from Memphis who runs the CDC there, and she said it's not as if Black neighborhoods don't like bike lanes. They've been clamoring for safer streets for their kids for decades. It's just about, and bike lanes inherently make a street safer because they act as a buffer between people and cars in many respects. It's just a matter of how you frame it. And I'm curious how, with the global protests, as you mentioned, with the easing of restrictions on outdoor dining, with even some of the most conservative mayors adopting slow streets and open streets, how should we be thinking about that in neighborhoods that are underserved or have less resources? You're seeing a lot of that happen in the downtowns of the world. As it enters neighborhoods, I'm curious on your opinion about what how the language we should be using, and landmines we should be looking out for, and all that stuff.
Well, you reminded me of something, or when Joe had asked, like, how else have the processes changed? We're using much more common language. So in the beginning of this process that we're on right now, the engineers and the planners would be off in the corner working on the presentation, and then they would show it to people. And we're over here like, oh my God, people do not understand all that plannerese. There's way too many layers in that map key. People are not going to get it. So now that team is now conferring with us, like, does this make sense to the common citizen? So we've reframed how we talk about things. Like, even through the course of this conversation, I've been like, what does that mean when you're like democratizing the streets or COVID streets? I'm like, what kind of new plannerese is this? Like, I don't even know that terminology yet. So I would say, like, think of, like, you both have kids, right? Like, ask your kids, can you understand this concept I'm trying to get across? And if they can get it, then, you know, most people can understand it. It should be really common. I don't know why, you know, a separate language even exists. Like, I'm always conscious of the words I use because I'm trying to connect with people. I'm aware that when I'm using certain jargon, it's to impress people. And as a Black person on mostly white planning teams, I find that, you know, I got to drop the jargon so that people know that I know what I'm talking about. But I shouldn't have to do that. Like, the fact that I'm there should denote that I'm competent. But there's this dynamic that has existed in practice where, okay, like, I gotta show that I know what I'm doing. But when I'm talking to citizens, like, I want to connect with as many people as possible, and it doesn't make sense to use that plannerese. Like, for what purpose? So yeah, the language should definitely change. And I think the conversation about bike lanes in particular it's layered, because what bike lanes signal to folks in Black communities is that the hipsters are coming. But I have a friend that worked in mobility, and he's like, you know, the #1 group of bike riders in Detroit is Black men of low income. That is something that you would suspect, but you know, for a variety of reasons, that's how those folks get around. But there's just this perception around bikes and bike lanes that it's the young white hipster, and it's like, if that comes to your neighborhood, that's who's going to move in, and that's who it's for. So if you want to introduce infrastructure like bike lanes, you also have to provide space for having a broader conversation about what that means. You have to change people's minds about biking in particular before you just lay down the lanes and then expect folks to figure it out.
Yeah, it's as simple as just asking people what they want on their street too. I think we come in with often with a set of designs and say, there's this much room, we can fit on-street parking and a 2-way cycle track and 2 lanes of car traffic and a wider sidewalk.
Well, again, we tend to start with the built environment, but talk to people about what they want, and then we can apply it to the tools in our toolkit. There are a lot of assumptions when we go in. Like, think about, again, the plan I'm working on. The assumption is these 4 areas that the planning department has chosen are the ways to make sustainable change in this community. Like, it's already been figured out before we even get there. In their minds, they're like, no, it's a really open process. I'm like, but you've already defined the 4 target areas. Maybe those aren't the areas that people need a change in. So we got to, you know, be aware of all the assumptions that are made before we even start the process that we don't really think about.
Yeah, we have a term for that. It's like this supply addiction. Like, we're addicted to the things, like, right? Mm-hmm. You know, oh, this neighborhood hasn't seen investment in 50 years. It needs more things. And while it probably does need some things, don't assume you know what the right things are and what comes first, second, third, and then what are some of the other needs that are maybe even more, higher priority. I want to connect a few of the dots, Lauren, because you've raised a lot of good points here around jargon, around engagement in an era where we have to kind of be more distant from each other, and working in communities where, I'm generalizing, but where many of the folk don't feel safe yet coming outdoors, either for health reasons or, there's a number of reasons why you wouldn't feel safe going outside right now. In the Zoom era, we're on Zoom right now. Do you find that methodology is actually exacerbating or has the risk of exacerbating that disconnect? Like, if I am the white planner and I load up my presentation, and rather than seeing the 3 of you and your sets of eyeballs and your body language, I'm just speaking to kind of my screen because there's like 50 or 100 people from the community if they're logged in at all. I don't get any of that feedback loop of like, are people even understanding what I'm saying? Like, are people tuned out? Are people confused or angry, or, you know, what the emotion of the room is, so to speak? What have you found particularly ineffective or effective in engagement during these very peculiar times where we either have to be physically removed from one another or more spread out than we typically have been in the past at smaller numbers? Is there any
Well, again,
wisdom you can drop on us?
Yes, this is another way that our process has changed given global events. Now the folks on the team with the technical expertise, well, what is perceived to be the superior technical expertise, are now filtering that through us, the engagement consultant, before we present it to people. So what would have been like an hour presentation with a lot of maps and planneries in it is now like a 20-minute presentation. That is spoken in very common language. And instead of using so many maps, we're using actual pictures of things in the neighborhood to kind of define terms for people. So less talking, more listening. And the way that we do it, we usually have one person that's kind of moderating the conversation, and then another person on our team can be looking at the questions on the sidebar, and I can text my colleague and be like, hey, so-and-so has a question, or so-and-so has a hand up. So we can bring in questions that way. But the fact that we've been having these weekly Zoom, we call them office hours, like we already know where people's heads are at. Not everybody, because we're only getting maybe like 40 people consistently every week, but it's not going to be a shock, the kinds of questions that people ask, because we're now in relation with those people. We kind of we've got a sense of the pulse of the people that show up. So again, like less presentation, more dialogue. And I know it's hard because we feel like we have so much information we want to get feedback on, but it's really not about that. There is ancillary ways that we communicate with people. We're like, here's the web address. So if you want to see the deeper details of the plan, go here and you can look at a longer slide presentation with a lot of background info, so that we don't use our time in person with people, having people just look at slides. Like if you want that detailed slide presentation, go to the website. This is more for dialogue and conversation. So you make space for all of those things to exist, but know that your in-person time is valuable, and people's Zoom attention span is much shorter than their real life attention span, which is already short, in particular for planneries.
Yeah.
You know?
Do you find any particular methodologies to be effective now around more analog approaches, getting off the Zoom, that where people feel welcome and safe amidst the pandemic?
Well, yeah, that came up in today's call. There was an older woman who like, nobody on my street knows what's happening. So we asked, like, how can we get information to people on your street? We're going to do some flyering. We have thought about putting information at high traffic essential areas like laundromats, certain bus stops that people use a lot. The dollar store, like go to places people are and leave material so they can read it, and kind of, we have a survey that people can call in and leave their responses to on a recording. But it's not enough. And we have a huge digital divide in Detroit. So we recognize that this planning process that we're engaged in now is even more exclusive than it usually is. Mm-hmm. And we're trying to figure it out in real time. But right now what it looks like is postcards that'll go door to door. We have some displays around town that have the website address and an address to go fill out a survey, and kind of some info about the plan and where we are in the process and why we're doing it. But still, it's hard to get people excited about that.
You know, you mentioned earlier the client being the city, but the client really being the community. We talked a little bit about that last week. You know, that oftentimes the client, technically the person paying you, is the city or some kind of government entity. Mm-hmm. How do we start thinking about the client, in this case the city, the person paying the bills? How do we start convincing them to be a little more patient and a little more willing to not let the tail wag the dog, or, oftentimes they'll say, let's hire Lauren and Yarden Company to come in because we have a HUD grant or not a HUD, let's say a DOT grant that's going to pay for a streetscape, or or a housing choice neighborhood grant, or something's always starting a process with a timeline. Do you have any thoughts on how we can operate within that? I don't think we're going to eliminate that necessarily, but operate within that, but still create these opportunities for patient growth and inclusive growth.
Yeah. The funding usually dictates the timeline, right? I think that something we are really intentional about is what happens after we're gone, understanding that we are just there at a moment in time, but we are only successful, like our consultant team is really only successful at engaging the community if there's a framework for people to stay connected to city planning and this plan after we're gone. So what relationships can you put in place that will live on after you're gone? So we've created a community advisory. So what I'm always thinking about is how can we ensure that those folks stay in communication with city planning after our participation? I think that is the most important thing. It's not, this planning process isn't just like we're done at the end of the year, but that isn't when the neighborhood's finished and it's everything it should be. So yeah, we just have to leave in place some relationships that ensure that connection extends beyond us.
You mentioned at the beginning, Lauren, that there should be, and maybe you've had success in creating space for community members to actually be employed as part of the process and being paid for their time and their contribution. We have a phrase that we use a lot to build movements, not just plans.
Mm-hmm.
Have you seen that kind of ambassadorship that's created as part of a time-bound planning process translate into something that maybe has legs on its own to carry that ball forward after the planners go back home?
No, not yet. Usually when we label something ambassador, it's like a cute little designation and we give them, there's a little stipend. It's money that none of us would work for.
It's a gift.
But like I have not seen yet where people really take community contributions seriously and start paying some real money, and treat those folks as the consultants that they are. I have not seen that work yet. But again, I think we're in this window of opportunity where that kind of stuff can happen. Like we had a giant consciousness shift in the past couple weeks. So I think what you are talking about couldn't have existed in our previous level of awareness. But the space we're in now, I think that can totally happen.
What do you think is, we only have a couple minutes left, but what do you think is different about this moment than past moments we've had like this in the last 5 years?
I don't know so much. It's frustrating because I feel like I saw the term performative allyship recently, and I'm like, yes, that is what is happening. Like lots of people want to be like, oh my gosh, I'm so conscious about racial equity. Look at all that I've done. But I can't believe that people have changed that much in that short of period of time. I believe that a lot of new people are now on their journey through racial awareness. But I feel like what is different is that more people understand the experience of being marginalized. Like a lot more white people are out of work right now.
Okay.
A lot more white folks are, needing services that they haven't needed in the past. So they're now in a position where they understand the lived experience of what some people have been going through. So I feel like there's a greater empathy.
It's really interesting. So the fact that this is happening in the midst of a recession.
Yep, it was a perfect storm of things. It's not just George Floyd. It is all the things I think that are making people open their minds and their hearts.
Yeah, I think the allyship comment is interesting. I think that, so I'm not a huge fan of social media at times as a reality, but the level of using that term allyship that we've seen from companies and individuals across social media has been pretty
Yes. Well, different. What happens is like a company will make a statement then a bunch of people that work there will post all the ways that they've experienced racism at the company. So brands and
Right.
corporations and individuals need to be aware of their own behavior when they're taking steps like that.
Well, so we try to keep these things to 30 minutes, Lauren. But is there anything we didn't touch on around all these issues that you wanted to touch on, just to give you one more minute here?
Well, I'm thinking about shifting my practice into something that's more restorative. I might even call myself a reparation strategist. So if we can think about every project we work on as an opportunity to repair some damage that's been done to a place. We're not going to fix all the things, but how might our work have a greater impact if that was the approach that we took?
Interesting.
So think about our own role and title and job within all this. Yeah. That's great. Well, thank you for joining us. And thank you to everyone else who joined us today. Next week, we will be back. It's our final ANCO installment, at least for now. We're going to be talking with Rebecca Kick, who works for the city of Kalamazoo, Michigan, and she's going to give us the perspective of a creative city administrator and how they've been dealing with this there. They've been doing some interesting work. There'll likely be a time change on that, so keep an eye out. We're usually right at 3, but we're going to have to move it a little bit earlier based on her schedule. So thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you next week. See you later, Lauren.
Bye. Thanks.
Lauren. Bye.
Thank you.